Welcome to Tossing Grenade the Windmills. Windmills.
Until we can get you to a healer. He looked at the Skald. What's all this, then?
That was the jaws of winter. Your soldier should not have been able to do what he did.
The sergeant looked at Nax. He cocked his head a moment as if trying to see something that wasn't there and shrugged. Well, I don't know how he did it, and I can tell you for sure Nax didn't. He's got all of the complexity of a fork. Nax had to wonder at exactly what that meant. What he did know was that he didn't want to stick around the inn any more. He picked up Plort with the sergeant's help and made his way to the large group of tents inside the city holding the soldiers. You'd think that since they volunteered to be last, that the others would have held some rooms for them, but it didn't work out that way. Just before they went into the healer's tent, Nax looked back to see the Skald outside staring at him. Nax didn't want to think about it and entered the tent. The healer was an old woman with busy eyebrows and shifty eyes. Her hands were amazing. She spun her potions and bandages like spinning a loom, and before long, Plort's eyes were open and he was looking about. The sergeant looked at the healer. Why isn't he moving? I've paralyzed him to help with the healing. She had a surprisingly deep voice for such a tiny frame. The sergeant nodded. Will he be ready for the wall tomorrow morning? The healer shook his head. Lucky bastard. The sergeant muttered to himself and motioned for Nax to follow him outside. Much to Nax's relief, the Skald was gone. Nax didn't want to think about it. Dawn came way too quickly. Nax was a veteran, so he got his armor on quickly enough and got to the top of the wall around the city, ready to defend it from whatever forces the Fatebinder might bring to bear. The earth shook. In fact, it shook a full hour before they saw any troops. Tiny bits of stone from some of the houses with poorer masonry crumbled loose. Horns and drums played in the distance as the banners from 4 different nations. Each of Spielglass's enemies lined the field. What hurt was seeing the banners from the other Spielglass city-states. The thing was that they had been changed slightly. They still looked like the old banners, but with an added mark here or there to denote subservience to the other nations. Nax couldn't tell much more than that. He wasn't a Skald. There was a loud hiss and a crack of thunder in the distance as large stones and exploding spheres of wood pummeled the wall, but it wasn't anywhere near as heavy as Nax thought it would be. They had kept their distance well out of the range of Glashouse's own catapults. Nax suspected that the Fatebinder had hired the Hushers to help him, but he'd been in enough campaigns to know that there was something weird about it all. They weren't trying to destroy the wall. Then he heard the sergeant whisper, They're looking for something. What? I don't know, but I hope they don't find it. Nax didn't know either, but he really didn't want to think about it. He just ducked his head behind the wall as another of the large missiles slammed into it. A short while later, another missile hit the wall, and then a third. The sergeant looked at Nax. The sergeant's wrinkled face was hard to read, but he finally got a look of resolve and pulled him back down the wall. Where are we going, Sergeant? I want to check something. A few officers almost looked like they were going to challenge them as they moved off the wall, but the sergeant gave them such a look that they backed off. At first, the sound of the impacts grew dim, but then it increased again. Without getting back up off the wall, the sergeant waited a few moments and then looked at Nax. Then they proceeded to go right back down to the same place in the wall that they'd started from. It took less time now, and the sound of the strange siege engines continued hurtling projectiles. It was enough to kill a man, but the walls stood firm. Still, the healers and the helpers had their hands full carrying the wounded back behind them. You, the sergeant said. What is it about you? Nax shrugged. He didn't want to think about it, but the hard stare of the sergeant drilled into him. The sergeant got around and looked him right in the face. The sound of the missiles increased, hammering and raining shards of wood and light stone all over the men. The sergeant ignored it, standing firm, not even blinking. Nax squirmed. I don't know, sir. Honest, I don't. Well, we're going to find out, aren't we? The sergeant picked him up by the scruff of the neck and dragged him to the campaign tent. The Lord Thrain was inside, and was not a happy man. He looked with annoyance at the 2 guards at the outside of his tent. They dutifully stared forward and pretended not to notice the Thrain's withering glare at allowing someone to enter unchallenged. Nax approved. The Thrain looked from his own Skald, a man much older than the Skald in the bar, and back to the sergeant. He sat down on his small wooden battle-throne, awaiting an explanation. The sergeant said, I don't know, sir, that's why I'm here. They keep targeting him. "Targeting him?" the Lord Thrain echoed. "Yes, sir. The siege engines always follow him." The Lord Thrain looked very tired. "And you thought bringing him to my tent was a good idea?" The sergeant suddenly looked very chagrined and said, "I didn't know what else to do, sire." "No, I imagine you didn't." Nax didn't know what to do in the situation, so he kept his mouth shut like his mother had taught him to. It was amazing how useful a survival skill keeping your mouth shut could be. The royal Skald looked Nax up and down. He slowly stood up from his chair and moved around to Nax, trying to examine him from every angle. Nax tried to ignore him, but this proved highly unsuccessful, as large bony fingers poked and prodded him. Nax finally slapped the old man's hand away when he pinched Nax's cheek. He said, "All right, enough of that." The old man looked startled and said,
"Have you seen any signs of portents lately?"
Nax wanted to feign ignorance, but that would be hard. Almost nobody knew anything about the lower secrets, like magic or husher stuff, but prophecy was something that they taught you about as soon as you could speak, so that wasn't going to fly. It would be like pretending not to know the difference between a wide-head arrow or a narrow tip. Well, maybe. This was a much more reasonable defense because everyone thought they saw signs at one point or another in their life. That was one of the reasons people listened to Skalds, who were a lot more literate on this kind of thing. It kept you from going around from pub to pub giving people haunting looks and saying, "You must give me a beer according to prophecy." So Nax just said, "I saw some weird cats and some trees acting kind of weird, but I didn't pay much attention." The royal Skald nodded.
"And how many weird cats and trees did you see?"
3. At this the royal Skald took in a deep breath.
"Yes, I think that you are bound to prophecy, which explains the Fate Binder's interest in you."
Nax's eyebrows raised. "Me? That didn't sound like a good thing."
"Were there any other signs or portents? Anything unusual at all?"
Nax sighed. He hated thinking about this kind of thing. "Well, there was those 3 clouds."
"Yes?"
Nax shrugged. "They were clouds. There were 3 of them."
"And what made you think it was a sign?"
"Well, they looked a lot like giants." The royal Skald nodded sagely.
"Were they doing anything?"
"Fighting." The royal Skald had a look of triumph on his face. He turned to the High Thrain and was about to speak when a dragon leg as thick as a barrel, attached to a foot as large as the High Thrain's battle throne, came crashing through the tent. This had the unfortunate side effect of crushing the royal Skald to a bloody pulp. The tent poles collapsed, sending the tent and everyone in it scattering to the 4 winds. Nax didn't know what was going on, but he knew that he didn't want to be around here. He fled north. The dragon's talon reached out and grabbed him, pulling him back toward the Fate-Binder who rode on the dragon's back. Nax took out his halberd and sliced at the talon in vain. The sharpened blade bounced off the scaly skin. He felt himself rise into the air, staring at the Fate-Binder eye to eye. Hello." He squirmed to get out of the dragon's talons.
"You have to die."
Nax tried chopping the dragon's claw a few times, but it did no good. "I'd rather not."
"You have to die."
Nax just waited for the end, but then decided to give the dragon one more good whack with the halberd. It didn't do anything.
"You have to die to prove that prophecy can be beaten."
Nax really didn't want to think about this, but he did think about it. He had his whole life flashed before his eyes. He found himself thinking about having a family, and how likely it was now that that would never happen. He'd never have a son or a daughter to carry on the line. That's it. It was just going to be him, and what had he done with his life? Nothing. He was so caught up in the final thoughts about what a waste his life had become that he didn't notice the bright white light that surrounded him, causing the dragon to drop him in pain.
"What is this?"
The Fate-Binder shrieked and threw several daggers at him, which were eaten by the flame. Nax dodged most of the daggers, but he could feel the flame eating at the metal of the daggers as if they were mere snow. He tossed a rock back at the Fate-Binder, which bounced off the arcane weavings of his cloak and armor. The Fate-Binder unleashed a bolt of lightning from his fingertips. Nax could smell the ozone and felt fire rush up and down the nerves in his limbs. He couldn't move. He couldn't hurt. The pain hurt so much. And then the fire that had eaten the daggers moved back up along the lightning bolt and engulfed the Fate-Binder in azure flame. Nax didn't really know about the fire. He tried concentrating and making it burn hotter, which it didn't, so he picked up another rock and threw it at the Fate-Binder. The Fate-Binder tried dousing himself with water, and failed. His flesh was being eaten by the unnatural fire, though his attempts to repair it were at least stalling his inevitable destruction.
"You have to die!"
The Fatebinder unleashed a lash-ditch talisman etched with runes and metal husher bands to enhance its explosive nature. The flame ate it, and turned it to ash before it had gone even halfway. Nax threw another rock. Nax barely had the presence of mind to look down on himself and see the light, trying to ignore the feelings of futility and depression that battered against the walls of his mind. The light moved around him and about him, getting brighter and brighter. Finally, a giant shaft of light came down from the sun and surrounded him, like the searchlight of a lighthouse. The Fatebinder knelt down on one knee, shielding his eyes from the impossibly bright light, but instead the light burned him and the dragon to a cinder. Nax slowly got up, unsure of what was going on, and then moved over to kick the ashes out of spite. More bright lights fell down from around the city, slamming into the armies surrounding Spellglass, burning them to a crisp. Was he the cause of that? Was he responsible for killing thousands of people? Nax didn't want to think about it, and with that the light faded. When he woke, he had a pounding headache. The universe had wanted him to live. Why, he didn't know, but apparently the gods took umbrage when mortals tried to make out the pawns in whatever games they played with the lives of mortals. He slowly sat up and checked all his parts. 2 arms, 2 legs, devastatingly handsome face, hair, entertainment division. Yeah, he was intact. The same could not be said about the rest of his unit. Nax looked at the sergeant in his bed, waiting for him to wake up. "You okay, Sergeant?"
"What happened?"
"I burned everyone, or something around me did."
"Huh. Something around you did."
Nax smiled at that and kept waiting by the sergeant. He wasn't sentimental or anything, but he wanted to make sure that the old guy came out of this okay. They had a job to do. It took some time to get a shovel and bury everyone in the old company. They had to be found and then a large hole dug. The sergeant was in no position to help dig, but his sharp eyes did help identify bodies quicker than Nax ever could. But the ground was cold and hard, and the clay clung to the shovel every time he struck it in. All told, it took 6 weeks to do the job right. Nax wanted to bury everyone, but he was just one man. It wasn't going to happen. With every body they buried, the sergeant said a eulogy. Nax was quite impressed about how much he knew about each of the soldiers who had been under his command. He knew who they worshipped and what the tenets of their religion were. In a few cases, it was obvious he had to make up a few things along the way for the ceremony, but never about the details of their lives. It ate Nax up. He felt responsible for them. According to the royal sage, Nax was destined to be the ancestor of someone very important. It was a particularly important prophecy, but they refused to tell him much. Most people with secrets worth keeping in the world were like that. According to them, Nax himself was never going to do anything of great importance. That suited Nax just fine. The important thing was that he was able to take care of the Sarge, setting him up for life with a very pleasant amount left over. Of course, as he investigated his benefits a bit more, it became apparent that his descendants, and therefore his health, were a matter of national security. That meant the state had to help Nax produce as many heirs as possible. He thought he'd live through it somehow.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Thomas Ricks. Music by Melanie Ricks. Voices by Skip Huffman and Josie Bergen-Lawson. Copyright 2015, Red Anvil Amalgamated, LLC. All products available on Amazon.com and other markets.
To fight the forces of evil!